This lecture is over the voice and the body and delivery. So nonverbal communication, mainly as it pertains to public speaking, but we will probably look at a few other instances where nonverbal communication is important as well. In delivery of a speech, nonverbal communication is very important. Different nonverbal elements can clarify the meaning of a message, to make it clear if you're being serious or if you're joking, or if it's something that has grave consequences or it doesn't matter very much. People can tell that by your nonverbal expression. Nonverbal elements in delivery can help facilitate feedback. In other words, it can open the channel for conversation between the speaker and the audience, even if that conversation is just nonverbals. But on occasion, the speaker will ask a direct question of an audience member, and nonverbals can help that audience member understand that this is a real question that they need to answer. Nonverbals will also help build relationships with audience members, just in general. We've all seen speakers who seem cold and disconnected. That's because, largely anyway, because of their nonverbal behavior during the speech. A lack of eye contact, hiding behind a podium, things along those lines. So it's the opposite of building the relationship, is actually pushing the relationship away. So things like open eye contact and open gestures and stance, those all help build relationships with audiences. You can also establish or diminish your credibility by your nonverbal behavior. So if you spend a lot of your time dancing around on the stage, shuffling around, pacing, those kinds of things, that it doesn't send a lot of clear messages that you are a confident and credible individual. In fact, it kind of says the opposite. Part of nonverbal communication that's often overlooked is the voice. Your voice is actually nonverbal. Now, your voice carries language, which is verbal. So that's why people overlook this. It's what's called paralanguage. Paralanguage is not what you say, but it's how you say it. So here it's the voice. This is also sometimes known as vocal codes, vocalics, and maybe a few other things. But I prefer the term paralanguage. Part of paralanguage is volume, the relative loudness of the speaker's voice. Some factors for changing your volume if you're delivering a speech, of course, would include the size of the room, but also the number of people. The more people there are, the louder you need to be most of the time, because bodies soak up sound. They're soft surfaces, and so the voice doesn't bounce around the room as much when there's more people in there. Another consideration you might make is if you're using a microphone or not. If you're using a microphone, typically you don't have to be as loud as you do when you're not using a microphone. Another thing to consider is the level of background noise. If you're in an open room that's it's got other meetings going on, other people in other places, you're going to have to be louder than if you're in a room that's all closed up. You can also always look for audience feedback. If your audience seems to be straining to listen to you, then you might want to turn up your personal volume. Another part of paralanguage is pitch. That is the range of sounds from high to low that our voices make. Intonation is the rising and falling of pitch. So this indicates a lot of different things, from making the difference between a statement and a question, or indicating a change in mood when you have been jovial and laughing and now you're dead serious. Intonation helps prevent monotone speeches. Monotone meaning one tone or one pitch. So intonation helps change up your sound so that it doesn't get so boring for your audience. Then we have something called uptalk. which is where the end of your sentences always sound like a question and your voice goes up. You could try reading this example out loud, making everything sounds like a question even though it's not. More about paralanguage, we have rate, that is the speed or pace at which you speak. Especially for public speaking, you should practice your rate. So, well, obviously, you should be practicing your speeches. So when you practice your speeches, practice for time. In classes, typically you're given a time frame that you need to meet. And in other cases too, but mainly in classes. So you need to practice to make sure that you can meet the time requirement, either the low end or the upper end. You also need to make sure you're not talking too quickly for your audience to have time to understand what you're saying. We also have the idea of pauses here. We don't like to pause in silence because our culture doesn't like silence. We need to fill up every silence with some kind of a sound, some kind of a noise, and that's where vocal fillers come from, at least in part. Vocal fillers, things like you see there, ums, uhs, and so on, those happen when we have to stop and think most often. And we have been trained that if we have to stop and think, then we're showing some kind of weakness, that we are unprepared in some way. It's not always the case. It's better to pause in silence. Sometimes we use pauses as for dramatic effect, to enhance a point, to drive it home. There's a lot of different ways that you can use pauses. You put all of these different elements of paralanguage together, you have what's called vocal variety. And an effective vocal variety can make or break a speech. Effective or ineffective can make or break. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. It's always good to express the enthusiasm that you have for a topic, but don't overdo it. You have two more concepts here about the voice. Pronunciation has to do with the correct formation of word sounds, making sure that every part of a word that should be heard is heard. And then articulation is similar, but different at the same time. It's the clarity or forcefulness with which word sounds are made. So it might be easiest to define this by defining the opposite of it. The opposite of articulation is mumbling, or slurring words together where things are hardly audible. And then lazy speech is also the opposite of articulation. It's where you put words together, as you can see the examples here. Now we move on to the body in delivery. One suggestion I can make to you is that you animate your facial expressions. In other words, don't be afraid to smile, to raise an eyebrow, to give a stern look. All of these different things indicate something different. And so when you're delivering a speech, if something's really important or something's really serious, your audience needs to be able to tell that on your face. Another big part, at least in our culture, of public speaking is eye contact. You want to maintain eye contact with your audience. And when I say maintain your eye contact, that doesn't mean that you should stare at one person or even two or three people alternatively. Scan around the room. If you have a room full of 25 people, you need to offer all of them eye contact, even if they're not all looking at you. So scan around the room, offering your eye contact. You don't want to generally maintain eye contact any longer than 1 to 2 seconds per person at a time. So you look at that one person for 2 seconds and you break eye contact and you move across the room, and you may come back to them in another 5 or 10 seconds, and that's fine. But you don't want to exceed that 1 to 2 generally. If you're really trying to drive a point home, You may exceed 1 to 2 seconds, but don't exceed about 3. Anything longer than that gets uncomfortable for your listener. You also want to consider using gestures, but you want to use natural gestures. Most of us talk with our hands whenever we're having a conversation with someone. Even me making these recordings, I make gestures, even though no one can see me. Those are natural gestures, things that help us to think while we're talking and to express ourselves. Use those within a speech when you can. Sometimes they require some practice, and it seems odd to say that you need to practice natural gestures. But if you're not aware of what you're doing, you may fall into repetitive movements, as you can see some examples here. These are just some examples of the things that I see in my classes. Movement around the stage is also good. You want to move with purpose. When you practice, you need to be practicing on your feet so that you can determine when you need to move and where you need to move up on that stage or in front of people. Sometimes people will move when they transition from point to point, and that extra movement of the body helps enhance the fact that we're moving into a new point. Also, when you're giving a speech, make sure that you dress appropriately for the occasion. This doesn't always mean that you need to dress to the nines in formal attire, but you need to match the audience's expectation for you as the speaker. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to underdo it either. As I was just saying, you need to practice your delivery. When you practice, focus on the message that you're trying to deliver. It may be helpful to record and watch your speech, though I know most of you won't do that on your own. Don't be afraid to revise your notes. Even if you've already printed it out once, paper's cheap. Go back into your Word document and edit. Change what needs to be changed. I've discovered that handwriting notes often does not work for me. So handwriting changes onto my outline is not effective for me. It may be okay for you. But don't be afraid to revise those notes. Throw away the original copy and print out a new one. Practice under realistic conditions. In other words, on your feet and as close to the situation you will be presenting in as possible. Also, make sure that you are very aware of time. Whenever you practice a speech, oftentimes you will speak about 20% slower than you do in real delivery. So when you get up in front of a crowd, you'll talk faster than you do in practice. So keep that in mind. When we're talking about nonverbal communication, whether it's in public speaking or it's in interpersonal communication or even in a job interview, you want to show enthusiasm when enthusiasm is important. Being enthusiastic will boost your nonverbal effectiveness. People want to see that you're excited about what you're discussing. But if you don't care about your topic, most times, your audience is going to know that just because of your nonverbal behavior. Charismatic speakers, or speakers with a lot of gusto, a lot of energy, they have a way of working a crowd. And there's some people that kind of seem to have this natural ability to do that. Most people feel like it's all natural ability, but a lot of it is training. And to a certain extent, anybody can get there. Their nonverbal communication is just excellent. The amount of eye contact they make at the right time, their pace, their overall energy is very on point, and it's very intentional. People are invigorated by this style of delivery. However, there is a dark side to enthusiasm. You can take it too far and become too enthusiastic and too over the top. So, like I said earlier, effective or ineffective nonverbals can make or break a speech. So you want to be careful. A speech can be incredibly well written, and still the audience will miss the point if you get up there and act insane. If you are so far over the top that they get lost because they're questioning whether or not their safety is in jeopardy because you seem to be so over the top. So make sure that you practice well. You control any excess emotion or excess energy, but you use enough energy to be charismatic. And this is just something that takes time. It takes effort to develop your ability to use it well. But you don't want the importance of your message to be lost in extreme nonverbal delivery.